Well, welcome to the Saturday, the third day of RSD8. I think by now you know Birger Sevaldsen and me, and so we want to spend a little time this morning with you in more of a dialogue. But first, we're going to have a dialogue with each other. That we're going to have an exchange of our ideas and want to basically share with you where we've come from over the last 8 years, where we see the field evolving and going to, and how we'd like to see everybody, how we'd like to see you participate, and ways in which we can continue to participate together. And so, very honored to have this time to share with you this morning, and just it's been really a delight to be here at the Institute of Design, and especially following up yesterday's amazing, inspiring talks. And so I'm glad we're following today and not yesterday with regard to that. So we want this to be dialogic. After our exchange, we'd like to hear from you and to have more of an exchange among us, and not just between you and us, but between all of you and all of ourselves. And the pitch works well for our talk to you, but we'll see how it works as we continue from there, and to invite your participation. So our purpose today is to have a joint reflection about the history of RSD, just a brief kind of story of how we got here and how systemic design has been unfolding. So the title Worlds Within Worlds is a way of suggesting that RSD itself has been unfolding within a number of different disciplines that have given it space to evolve, and that in that we see not just systems thinking, but systemic design as a way of taking action from systems thinking in ways that can be productive across many different disciplines. And so we hope that this discourse opens up to the social sciences, humanities, philosophy, systems engineering, and the other systems thinkers. So we see this as being a real world type of context where it's not an academic discourse primarily, even though we're bringing a lot of, I think, good theory and research to the core. This is about what we can do with what we're learning. And the Systemic Design Association allows for research and design practice in the development of this, I think. So Birger and I had held a kind of editorial debate like this in the most recent special issue of Sheiji, the Tongji University published Journal of Design, Innovation, and Economics, as it's titled. And in this editorial, to cover the best articles, the selected kind of top articles that were developed from the keynotes, primarily from RSD6 in Oslo, we had different perspectives on some of the keynotes and the meaning and of some of the talks and their own. We found that it was probably better to have a point-counterpoint type of discussion instead of an integrated editorial between the two editors. So we thought we'd take those two perspectives, our perspectives, with you in the same way, and have not a debate, but an exchange about the different perspectives that we bring here. So our purpose is dialogue, but it starts with debate in some ways.
Okay. There's the next. Okay, if Peter is going to talk much more than me today, that's not a problem. I'm perfectly fine. It's just an expression of our different personalities. So I don't worry, and don't worry. I think it's fine. Yesterday we heard a little bit about wolves, and today we will hear a little bit about the dogs and cats. So we'll come back to that. Why did we start with this? I think it was feeling for a need to become better at dealing with complexity. And this is not a new feeling. It was not a new feeling in 2005 when I started with this. It was already in 1993 there was a seminar in the Finnish woods, very exotic, that was called the Challenge of Complexity. So that's when I actually met some of the central members of this community already. So the need for becoming better at dealing with complexity in design. The former systems approaches were either too technical or too ethnographic and seemed to disturb the flow of the design process. So there has been quite many attempts to integrate systems thinking into design, but they never really become mainstream. And I think Fred Colopy, who was one of our keynote speakers at the third RSD or something like that, he put it very nicely, how systems thinking failed in design because exactly it was like an alien import of ways of thinking that didn't really integrate well with design and designerly ways of working and thinking. So this was the purpose from the start, to find new ways of relating those two issues, like the designerly ways and to work with systems. At the same time, there was a notion that design was inherently systemic. If you really looked at behind what was doing, and that was also the argument of Harold Nelson, who was one of our early buddies. He's still with us, but he couldn't attend here. So we also felt the need for a sincere attempt to make sense of the design practices emerging and being discussed across several discourses, as transformation design, systems-oriented design, new thinking in social systems design, and the new story of design, co-creation, etc. I think right before we got together, Harold Nelson and Eric Stolterman had an initiative to collect systemic approaches and publish, make a special issue in, was it design issues?
Yeah.
Yeah. And had a call for that, and I submitted something and failed, and everybody failed, so it never happened. So then we thought, let's get together and start to talk. But it also became clear that nobody in design was articulating this area rigorously and in a compelling way. So how did we start at AHO? We just started to do it. And the first RSD, which you see here, it started as a seminar, and I had like a generous teaching budget, so I decided to burn it off all in 2 days, and invited the people that I thought were interesting. So, and that was actually quite a substantial seminar with between 50 and 100 people. And Harold, Alex, Ryan, and Peter were central. And so we were setting into the task to explore the range of design practices, methods, and research approaches, and a transdisciplinary collaboration to develop our practices, share methods, and the results. So this seminar actually then was the first RSD. RSD stands, as you all know by now, Relating Systems Thinking in Design.
So you might wonder actually how publication fails. Just to pick up on what happened with that design issues with Harold Nelson and Eric Stolterman. They had calls out for publications of the kind that you're creating now, and all of the contributions were unfit for publication. They were either too simplistic, too naive, too specialized, too focused, and not relevant between the emerging. There wasn't really yet an understanding of the emerging intersection of these fields. So this is a sketch note from Fred Colopy's talk. I'm not going to speak to that, but just to relate back to that. We were actually started RSD with this tension in the discourse of there not yet being a real shared understanding of how there was no sense of a field, There was no name of systemic design yet. The RSD was to invite the relating. And so we were really in, I think, a period of good opportunity, but none of us really knew where to go. So that's really led us to a position of the values I think we're taking here are of inclusion, broad inclusion, embracing the different disciplines, equality between the disciplines, and some humility that, well, we didn't know the answers. We weren't coming, from the first seminar, from the second RSD, from the third. We realized we weren't at the place of formalizing a field, and that was actually good. We wanted to kind of continue that way, and not knowing which direction to take at the time helped the all of the participants feel, I think, included to bring their agency as well, and being able to pick up where you left off and to maybe go in a different direction if it needs to go that way. So we believe that with RSD, it would help inaugurate and self-organize a new social system that could be inclusive of the new practices that could build on what we were doing. And by that, I mean, in our first workshops, our first exchanges of workshops, you'll hear a little bit more about this. I mean, Birger had been developing for a number of years the gigamapping practice and the mapping of complex systems directly with the stakeholders of those systems in complex visual graphics that were not meant as infographics, that of course were meant to actually construct the consensus view of the system that would be designed. And I worked with dialogic design, a practice developed from Warfield and Christakis' structured dialogue and interactive management that had a long history of structured analysis and development, actually very similar to Chuck Owen's type of structured software-enabled practice. And we exchanged those ideas very early on. So realized that there's a lot of space for design in this, kind of around the fuzzy edges of paradigmatic knowledges, as Saskia Sassen had suggested yesterday. So is this thing on? Okay. We believed then that the systems field naturally brought a body of theory that could be supportive of design practices, even in general. Even if design practitioners in the emerging, so this was not quite 10 years ago, but our earliest work together was 10 years ago. And that was very early in the stages of service design. The Service Design Network and Birgit Mager's work was all very nascent at that time. It was actually, there were very few books in service design. There was certainly none in systemic design. And we didn't see them as competing, but kind of stages of bounded design work, and that there isn't really a good natural customer yet for systemic design because there's no client that owns a system. You could say that in policy contexts or in perhaps in regulated policy systems such as healthcare, large healthcare systems, in military or in other government domains. Sure, there are complex policy-regulated systems with certain owners, but those are incredibly complex systems in and of themselves. There's no single owner. You're still working at the service level for the most part in those. So we believe that bringing the kind of a new thinking of design thinking to, that is, there was an emerging strong discourse 10 years ago in design thinking. We believe that systems thinking brought a lot to that exchange, and that systems thinking had a tradition of its systems practice was more in the action research tradition, but design practices were much more contingent, creative, elaborated with stakeholders, integrative. We used, instead of action research, more research through design and with design practices. But what was lacking, we thought, in a sense, in terms of systemic design, was this area that systems theory, even classical systems theory, had a lot to contribute to designerly practice as a supportive theory for how design decisions could be made. So we thought that this relationship really made sense.
Yeah. RSD, the conferences should span across the fields. And we realized that there were things growing slowly. Some things had been growing for many, many years. And graduate programs around the world independently formed systemic, holistic, transdisciplinary approaches for complex interaction between design and in complex systems. So we can mention what we call the core group, and I will talk a little bit more about the core group, why it's called a core group. It's, of course, the AHO from Oslo, Occard University, Politecnico Torino with Bistanino and Silvia Barbero, India's National Institute of Design with late MP Ranjan and now Praveen Nahar. And this is only the core group because these were the schools that were in a continuous dialogue, so anybody is invited to invade this core group and bring their plate to the table. So in addition, there happens things at IDEA, here obviously for many, many years, at Antwerp, TU Delft, Tangi, UTS Sydney, ETH Zurich, Chalmers in Gothenburg, Swinburne, Oslo Met, and Carnegie Mellon, of course. We're very excited what's happening there, and Aalto and others. So please invade the SDA. Peter and I, we have quite different backgrounds and come from different places. So we thought this would be make it a little bit personal quickly, to illustrate the diversity in the emerging field. I was educated a designer. My profession was interior architecture and furniture design, and I worked across the design disciplines, from architectural offices to also even early web design and industrial design. So this is something I really like, the in-between and the complexity, and I went very wide. And I became, through my digital work, a member of the OceanNet. This was an experimental, non-commercial design research practice coming from the AA in London. And we were in the middle of that discourses following deconstruction in architecture. There was the big discussions on the continuous planes and folding, and the blob architecture, of course, and behind it all the diagram, the generative diagram that was abstracting how you could create spaces that could be opportunistically inhabited by its users. So by teaching digital creativity, which also became my PhD in 2005, I don't remember exactly when I realized that I was blindly wading into a big field called systems thinking. So that's where I came from. I was like, I'll come back to the dog and the cat thing. So in 2006, we started. I had the first consistent studio course on the master's level at the Institute of Design, which we call Design for Complexity, and which very soon became systems-oriented design. In 2009, I had a very intensive semester where we worked very intensively with creating big visualizations, which this is a result from that year. To put a lot of energy and effort and a lot of time, like weeks and weeks, into making this kind of artifacts. And that's also when the notion of the GigaMap emerged. At the same time, systems-oriented design was sort of I intentionally refused to colonize the world with systems-oriented design. Instead, I looked upon this as part of a colorful family with many different perspectives and approaches. And this was already certain from the start that systems-oriented design was just one of several approaches, though I was sort of thinking that it was crystallizing as a design practice more than a theory or a coherent methodology even. So it was more like a praxeology of working with complexity. So there were no singular answers, and we were applying an open and tolerant and pluralistic worldview. So this also came from, I refused to suffer anymore from the dog-eats-dog atmosphere in the academic world, which also Susu expressed very nicely in our General Assembly we had on Wednesday. This mental dysfunction of the mind is based on a belief in one theory of nature, like the survival of the fittest. But John Ehrenfeld had a keynote at RSD6, and we already had started to talk about this other principle. There are many principles, but there's other main principle of which you see in nature, like which is based on collaboration, on care, and strategic alliances between species called flourishing. So it is a misunderstanding that the competition really nurtures the creativity. I think the flourishing principle in a way is much stronger, and this is what we want to invite you into. And this doesn't mean it's not critical or that there are no contradictions, but I think we're really onto something here. That is, the atmosphere here is very different from many of the other academic fields we are in touch with, I think. Yeah.
And we ask you to help us sustain it that way, too. That's what we call it, a thriving network in a flourishing community. But that is, the community that unfolds is actually larger than this direct network. We all bring the conversations from all the work that we've brought together into every RSD. It expands, worldwide in a lot of ways that we may not see directly. So where we can trace the social networks, you can see it's kind of a tight-knit community. A lot of people, there are probably half the people come to RSD again and again every year, so it's always good to see so many new people. But this has been, so I think it's important to know that, that flourishing is something that we're designing for, that we hope to see continue. My background is very different than Birger's. I had a mentor, Aleko Christakis. Alexander Christakis was one of our keynote speakers at RSD5 when I was the lead chair at Toronto in collaboration with Mars and at my school, OCAD University. And so Aleko also generously participated throughout the week that he was in Toronto with a Design with Dialogue, which is kind of the results of which are shown here. Aleko was a type of Chuck Owen figure, not just for me, but in his career. He was one of the co-founders of the original Club of Rome. In 1969, 1970, he collaborated with Aurelio Peccei to set up the predicament, or the predicament of humanity. That was Hassan Özbekan's prospectus to the Club of Rome, which was the proposal for what ended up being only two responses to the prospectus, Hassan's and the J. Forrester Donella Meadows limits to growth. You know how that history went. The limits to growth kind of won the prize because they had this great software modeling where they could use system dynamics modeling to show to model out and simulate the relationships of future outcomes from the complex system problems of the time. Aleko as a young physicist who was coming into this area that didn't really have a name at that time. They called it social systems design, partly because they didn't know how to design social systems yet. So this was, he wasn't my mentor then, although I did start in the field. I've been, I guess, my work has always been, has been kicked off at the interfaces of new technological and regimes. So my career after an undergraduate started with the PC revolution and the battle between Apple and Microsoft. I was actually on the IBM and Microsoft side, so maybe that's another thing. Maybe I'm a Bill Gates and you're a Steve Jobs, and there's a those are kind of types, and that was also very fruitful because I was more of a structured designer working with corporations and direct stakeholders, more of a systems engineering and usability as a science approach. I have a human factors master's degree, cognitive psychology and human factors engineering. That mindset, my education, my training, all my PhD is design innovation management, working with organizations and organizational processes in innovation and managing design. So my design skills and design practice were done in work, but not in my education. So I'm a design practitioner, but it's so much of it's like self-learned. So I was always drawn to the theoretical and the systems work. And so this is how my approach to this interdiscipline has evolved, as bringing I guess the spirit of some of my mentors, but in particular Aleko Christakis, who had also collaborated with John Warfield in his earlier years. So like Charles Owen's structured planning methodology, the early years, the practices of what was called interactive management developed in the early 70s after Özbekan's continuous critical problems. The problematique did not win. They developed software, interpretive structural modeling, that's used for structured analysis and structured dialogue. And so this has led to more structured approaches with stakeholders for strongly democratic approaches to developing consensus for governance on highly complex problems that are then activated by the stakeholders in that system. So that's probably my background. Probably a little different, but yeah. I'll be a Bill Gates.
I think we have around 10 minutes left if we want to have some dialogue. So we have to speed up a bit, maybe.
I thought our sessions were at 11, so our break's at 10:30, right? Break is at 10:30, so we want about 20 minutes of dialogue.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the core drivers were to induce significant social and institutional change. The picture here shows a group of 5 students facilitating a workshop with 50 civil servants from the Directorate of Elderly Homes in Oslo, inducing direct real-time systems change in their organization. So it's actually, never underestimate the power of some good systemic design students. They can do wonderful stuff that is directly applicable. So I want to say a little bit more about what is design actually bringing to the table. And we had this cool discussion with Tobias yesterday, looking at this map from an idea about empathy, where we discussed the question, could this better be represented by a text? And my response as the promoting the idea of gigamapping is multiple. Like a text is a linear approach to what is on that image, the kind of an interpretation of what empathy is. The map gives an instant overview of networks of interconnections and data. You can immediately discuss, like we actually did. We immediately jumped into the discussion. It communicates very efficiently. It added instantly to my conception of empathy as a complex phenomenon. You know, empathy is used as almost like a cliche in design, but I think this opened up to me. Like in split seconds, I understood, I reconceptualized empathy as something quite complex, and if you understand it, it's really useful to work with it. Of course, I would have to study, but it opened up, it reconfigured my view on it. It is based on perception as thinking, as Rudolf Arnheim argues in his visual thinking based on Gestalt psychology. It's a very strong designer tool to demonstrate the design way, as Harold would call it. As we all agree, it's not a picture of reality, but it's actually a design artifact. It is design. And therefore, it's based on constructivist learning principles, which, like how Vygotsky and others would define that. You could almost say designerly learning principles. And what is also special with the NID culture, that they use a lot of metaphors in their mapping, which really works very well as mental hooks. And if you look at the map, I cut away some. Sorry, I had to. I cut a little bit away from it, but there's actually quite a lot of text there. So, what is particular of the designers? What do we bring to the table? It's the visualization skills, synthesizing and imaginary skills of design, and to really bring the narratives and the fantasy and the stories of how things could be. However, we find that design without tools and theory, explaining the systems and environmental functions, engaging in real data and not just assumptions, it fails to change the system in which the service and the products are delivered. So
I'd like to say a few words about what systemic design is for. Another emerging, this has been an emerging field. I think if we look at the last 8 years, it's become something. There are other fields that are also now starting up in the last year or two. One that's quickly growing is the formalizing of what's known as systems change. And we talk about that a lot, and that's actually becoming. It's not a formal discourse, but there's a significant community of practice in the philanthropy, in the labs worlds, in the major foundations are looking to actually have systems change be what the impact of their funding and their process is going to be. So if we look at really the outcomes of systemic design, we have, and with all design, there's a sense in which that we have the aim but not yet the claims that we can make about systems change. This is still an emerging, contingent, not yet clearly formed area that has high aspirations, shared values with us, very similar aims for long-term impact. But what we find as designers, and I think you also find in the funded projects and systems change, is that what it requires to actually see the change take shape is this developmental, persistent, long-term, longitudinal period of interactive development with the stakeholders in the field, in the places where the change is actually happening. So this came up in Chris Rudd's talk yesterday, came up really in Terry's talk. I think this is going to be I think a continuing discourse between us. So many of us also are activists, and there's a way in which we use that word as perhaps systems change activists or as design activists, where we may not really be sure what that means or how we're activists or how that's different than social change activists. But I think there are real differences, and that's something that we should continue to explore. I'm an activist in the peace movement. I brought the World Beyond War international peace conference, and David Swanson and his organization in the U.S. have brought that to OCAD University, probably the first time a major peace conference with 300 people was held at a design school. I held workshops on the business model of war, trying to help understand the systems that contribute to that. I work with a drawdown project for reversing climate change by 2050. This is a very long-term, scientifically based approach. I work with the decolonization, indigenization movement in Toronto and Canada. And I also find you can't go right into these. I don't take my identity as a designer right into these discourse, right into that change practice. I want to be yet another citizen and learn about it, and then start to unfold the work, my students, and the work that we can do in systemic design as the dialogue takes shape. So I don't want to shape the dialogue right from the beginning. And I think maybe that's just my approach. I'm going to say I think there are different ways to be activists, but I think have to get skin in the game first, where we can be respected as having some stake in the change. So we can't, as designers, promise to change everything through design or policy fiat. In fact, trying to make change directly is anti-systemic. That is, it's first order. It's that we see a problem, climate change, let's look for the easiest place to make impact, let's roll back emissions, we'll change policies, maybe that should have an effect. Well, climate change is a result of 100 years of multiple overlapping systems. So in my experience, these societal changes will take time. The changing of norms and practices that we're going to interact with come through our niche interventions. Are you guys having another dialogue that's separate from...
Sorry.
Tell the whole class. So I think you're trying to tell me that,
No, we're fine. It's
okay.
Fine.
So, thanks. So I want to give you another example. So we talked about flourishing. So the flourishing business model was developed out of a ecological economist's research from almost 10 years ago. 7 years ago, we formed a design research group, and we actually rolled out the canvas for transition from things like, if you know the business model canvas, we critiqued that, created a completely different tool, and with the flourishing business model has now led to a worldwide community with over 1,500 people in the scientific community, and about 500 people that are using forums, that are using this. We have a new canvas coming out. We just started the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. That's a relationship of this research, of our research center in Toronto with about 8 other committed centers, including Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, which is one of the centers of positive psychology. It's also where Dick Buchanan and Fred Colopy are from. So these relationships took 7 years to create. So have some patience in some of your activism as well. So out of these, this is an example of a 3 horizons map from a climate change action plan that was taken together over several stages of stakeholder planning, and is a summary of the stakeholder and the city contributions as a way to visualize climate change action plan over the 3 horizons. Horizon 1 being, in this case, about a 10-year period as effectiveness drops off. Horizon 2, or the blue, or the middle period, phase period, as new technologies take shape and they're implemented into environmental and climate change planning. And the 3rd horizon, which is the going off to beyond 2030, which is the emerging green path. And so we're using visualization and gigamapping techniques as a way to get into, as a way to represent and visualize the outcomes of stakeholder work as well, in simpler ways that actually can be represented in that. Now, that's actually not an activist engagement, it's a professional one. But so finally, I want to say I see RSD as being a community of scholars and practitioners that can hold the possibility for change leadership, for design-led change leadership. But we also have this base of research and scholarship and stakeholder work as well that can be tied together. If you're familiar with the triple helix, or it's now the quadruple helix from our, that's actually, as it's published in the Sheiji issue. So design, I want to say one other thing that this is kind of more social change, but one of the, another social change example, but what I want to point to is a kind of another point of difference between like designers and systems people is kind of we might be optimistic for change in some of these cases, but there are a lot of examples where design-led change has led to suboptimal outcomes, where they really didn't foresee how the system was going to unfold. And so, especially in technological induced optimism, so considered to be system changers. So if you remember the One Laptop Per Child project from Nicholas Negroponte and Media Lab, and had a lot of industry support. They're going to give an identical kind of plastic ruggedized laptop to like every child in Africa. And it was the same laptop, considered for all the same, as if it were some sort of universal product that could be adopted and would address education and the use of computers. Well, there's so many things that it didn't address, many of which were obvious, like the lack of internet access, the lack of content, the way social practices were different in many different contexts and where they believed the host to be. There's this huge optimism for that project. It didn't play out. I'm sure you can think of many other projects. Another one of my students did was actually a commercial. He had commercial support for clean cook stoves, clean fuel cook stoves that could be used in African slum communities to displace charcoal cooking. And it really didn't work, not just because it was expensive and they couldn't find a way to do so, but to change the economies of it. But charcoal, even cooking indoors, is a slow burn cook, and most of the styles of cooking for the foods that they eat and the foods that were available have a different type of cooking style. And you go through a lot of clean fuel to cook anything other than hot tea. And and these are things you could observe through ethnography. But design often takes the brief, finds as much as it can do with it, and there's a lot of optimism. But the systems thinker is often thinking, well, you can start to see where this goes, and you don't want to say anything, but...
Yeah, I mean, I heard once that somebody said architects or systems people, we could say, are like cats. Distant and withdrawn, uncritical. Designers are like dogs, over-enthusiastic, naive, and easy to lead astray. So, so here we are, dogs and cats. So,
They fight sometimes.
yeah. So, yeah, we have our issues. Enthusiasm is, at its worst, is naive and dangerous, as Peter pointed to. At the same time, the energy and enthusiasm is absolutely crucial if we want to change anything. We need to have this energy and enthusiasm. Also the playfulness, and we had some nice lectures about play yesterday, and some cool discussions. And Tore, my good friend from Oslo, is very into play, game theory, and play is really important to understand, to explore, and to learn, to prototype, to probe real-life systems. Yes, I think we need both cats and dogs. So, our purpose as a community, and we will, this is probably repeating what we already said a little bit, but we want to create awareness and to advocate a position of pluralism, multi-perspective variety, participatory openness, disciplinary leeway, embracing new ideas, loyalty to humanity of legacy, as well as criticality, pragmatic impact of design, and future orientation. So in this, we have this publication ladder that many of you are involved in, which starts with the abstract submission, and what happens here with your presentations and discussions is the second part of that ladder. The third step is the working paper, and the last step is publication of a full paper in a scientific design research journal. This is to encourage new thinking and unfinished ideas that are not really through cooked, and to develop them in a dialogue. So this is really what we want with that. The other question is how to design a new academic practitioner community as a social system, which the SDA, the Systemic Design Association is about. Maybe this is more in the spirit of Donella, like dancing with systems rather than planning. It's about also timing. I think we were very good at the timing of this. It's about the zeitgeist, and it's a serendipity, meeting the right people in the way you found the people, and how trust was built over time, which was not a given thing. It had to be. We had to have our small things to really understand that this is what we wanted. And part of this is also how we express it through the social atmosphere at the RSDs. Somehow we were very lucky with this, so we got the powerful feedback on the relevance of our endeavor, with great keynotes accepting our invitation despite poorly paid honorariums. So this is like a little bit more about an idealism. And this year, again, with wonderful keynotes. Thank you very much for that. So I think it's you to the...
Let me wrap up. Yes. So I'd like to actually challenge us with some grand challenges as the cat here, in not just the only cat in the room, but two of the cats and dogs. Systems thinkers were more, can be often more realistic in that there's a real tradition of what's called critical realism in the systems school, which I think is finding its way into design education now. And so there's also this skepticism from the outcomes of projects, because in systems practice they actually don't have that much of a tradition of good implementation. They never worked well with designers. They didn't have quick wins. It was very difficult to keep a team of systems thinkers into a project for 5 years. Stafford Beer got to do some of this. Margaret Mead, Gregory Bates, and others in the early generations, Russell Akoff. Peter Senge tried, and I think actually that's where it started to break down, is it didn't really popularize in management as the MIT school really pushed. And there was a lot of learning. A lot of the Society of Organizational Learning took shape. A lot of that work continues with Otto Scharmer's Theory U community, but it really didn't stick with management like they thought it would. So what would our grand challenges be that we could really make some... I want you to think about that, and I'll have a few to consider. But this is one that my students, so I had to pick just one synthesis map, as we call them, and the Strategic Foresight and Innovation Program. And this is on the potential future of genetic editing through CRISPR for human gene line editing, and how that might evolve if it were based on other policies like that came out in artificial reproduction, for example. Very controversial kind of topic, and actually mapped out in a well-planned way. It's a grand challenge. It's an interesting ethical challenge that we should be wrestling with. And so systems thinking lets us kind of take a step back and not be so personally or value-based involved, not to necessarily bring our own values into the content, but into the representation, so that we can make ethical decisions based on a fair explication of some of the possible outcomes, both positive and negative, out of possible new social systems. So being able to envision and speak to and create resilient networks and new ties to communities, and to engage stakeholders and employers, and creating working with the new unfolding new economies. I think we can bring a lot to these problems into these social networks and these, However, we have to keep in mind that we may think that we're working directly with systems, but we're often tilting at cultures. We're working closely and directly with specific cultures and not the whole system. And so this will take some time. But when you consider some of the continuous critical problems, so I don't show Hasan Özbekan's, there were 49, it's hard to even show them. He had them typed out in the prospectus, but here's the millennial challenges, or the Millennium Project challenges, not the UN Millennium Goals, but the Jerome Glenn project of 15 of these continuous critical challenges that are used in their Foresight project. We have the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are really more solution orientations. And so, do these, is this, this is really what's on the table for us to work with. One of my former students is also now heading up the SDG Fund at the United Nations, and his talk will be presented this afternoon by me because he can't be here. This has gone from 24 recipient countries to now 36, and Nenad Rafa is very busy. But this is, but I want to bring this conversation into the room and into RSD, and so. With these kind of global or these grand challenges are problems that we can have a vision for and an opportunity to resolve for the sake of the future. And so I see a lot of these that could be within our grasp in our lifetime. And so I want to mention just a few that I think are inspiring to me, and that I'd like to kick it off with a dialogue to hear what your thoughts are on what we've said, and also perhaps on possible grand challenges. So one of them that's near and dear to my heart, kind of from the peace movement, where I believe peace needs to become a hybrid like war has become hybrid. We need something like a balancing global security system that can respect nations and cultures, have empathy for cultures even, to understand that people are different in different parts of the world. They have different ways of governing themselves. And we had a real relationship, diplomatic relationship through different forms of governance. We could end war as we know it. We have, there's a movement toward inclusive and balanced economies that could enable a steady state of monetary flow instead of success to the successful all the time. The capacity to wisely integrate human capabilities and wisdom into the evolving capabilities of quantum computing and advanced artificial intelligence. The balancing of human economies and material growth with environmental and climate boundaries. So I think those are probably shared by a few others in the room, and you might have different ways to represent them, but I wanted to open it up from there and see what questions you had for us and for each other, what we're missing, what we ought to consider, where you see things going. So thank you.
We had something called a throw box. Do you remember that? Yeah, that was really cool.
Thank you both for your presentation. It's quite inspiring. Thank you very much. I'm going to read this because I've tried to figure out how I was going to articulate my question. So in the context of sociotech impact models, we're facing grand and complex, wicked policy and mindset change. And all of this are triggered from different parts and different areas. And I guess all of it requires, as we heard in this conference today, concurrent interventions. And through the process of concurrent interventions, the system changes. There's, as we said, changing in behavior. And then the group adapts and appropriate the new context and build new connections, shifting the system. And I guess my question's from a place of funding, a place of ribbon cutting, a place of attribution of the impact in the context in the system that is shifting. And I'm trying to figure out and wrap my head around understanding and being humble that the interventions that we cause and create in the policy context are just, a ripple effect that I'm causing, but others are also causing in their own way as well. So how do you articulate, I guess, that ripple effect that you're creating in a dynamic changing system? So it's a very complex question, but I'm just curious from your point of view how to wrap your head around this, because the attribution of results and impact is a conversation that gets you funding or not, in a way. Yeah.
That's a terrific question. It also gets to transition design, the system change, and and certainly relevant to the RSD community. So one response that I would have, and Birger may have another, but one response is that in terms of not looking for attribution so much, but the ability to create some continuity with our niche level projects or with initial impacts in policy, and to a lot of times initial policies are formed not just from an agenda, but from there's more experimentation that's happening, but the experimentation is often very piecemeal. It's carving out one piece of the problem that might be addressed, but policymakers get rewarded for that, and so they want that piece to be successful. I think what we can do in our engagement in systems change or in policy labs is to enlarge the scope of their continuity, perhaps bringing academic research, social sciences research, for example. So SSHRC in Canada, the Social Science Humanities Research Council, is very interested in a lot of these same types of grand challenge questions, or which they call, they have a whole future challenges program. And so actually it's helpful for us to partner with social scientists as well as other disciplines, maybe engineering and hard sciences, biologists, for enlarging our scope of credibility, so we aren't the only voice in those. The other partnership that we might take in these different contexts is partnering with, so that's one partnership, and the other one would be in the systems change community itself, which may be smaller, but they're growing. And they're growing fast because there's going to be a lot of funding in the major foundations. The Rockefeller Foundation, Canada McConnell, and with Omidyar, all these foundations are starting to move towards systems change as the measure of merit for how change. So they're looking for attribution, certain types of impact. They don't know how to measure it all yet. We can look at things like principles-based or developmental evaluation, basically impact on those principles. And I think from a design perspective, this is what we haven't really done yet, is I think there are massive impacts that design can have that can be surprising and unexpected. And so that's what we can bring. That's in a way kind of the sharp point into that whole process, that design can make a huge difference. So by building those partnerships, some of which will have different temporal relationships, design might come and go. They might come in for half a year and then come back another year. But social scientists and academics might actually stick around for a 3-year grant, for example, on the same project and have some continuity and bring us back later. Because we have different life cycles for impact and for measurement. Does that address? Okay. Yeah.
Hi. Hello. Well, my question is about being an activist. So being an activist might need some acts or some sort of civil disobedience, as Thoreau would say. And I've been always wondering how we can act as researchers and activists within an institution such as the university. So...
I gave a couple of examples of what...
Peter, you should join us up here. It's much more cozy here.
Oh, yeah.
No, come. But you take this microphone. Woof, woof.
All right. We'll have a direct conversation about that. So, well, I gave a few examples for some of the things that we're doing at OCAD. So what I do with activism is I don't start with my values in the classroom as much as take them into the community and then see what emerges by using the space of the university as essentially free engagement place for the whole open community. People that are interested in changing foreign policy and just want to discuss how Canada could shift, or indigenization. We had talking circles with an indigenous leader who led like monthly talking circles for 2 years, plus other indigenous activists and wisdom keepers. And some of those led to ceremonies and fire circles on Toronto Island. So seeing where those lead by putting yourself into the field, I think first, into those. And so in climate change, we have a lot of direct action happening now. But what would be the best role for us with our students, actually? I mean, they may be inspired by the direct action. But I think as a professor, it's probably I have more impact in being able to bring a broader, a long-term point of view to introducing the science and having them engage in unique contributions that could be, giga mapping, for example, might be something that nobody has seen in a climate change discourse. And by being able to show these complex relationships, in the work that we can do is something we can do in the classroom and bring to, an activist context. I think there are things we can uniquely do, but also to get skin in the game, we have to, I think, also kind of humbly put ourselves into those contexts. And certainly if you have a university, if you're already a faculty member, you can book space for these large meetings. We just had 150 people at OCAD's auditorium for a climate solutions summit based on not just Drawdown, which is the project I'm working with. It's drawdown.org, by the way, Paul Hawkins, a top 100 ranked scientific solutions to climate change based on the scientific literature. And it's dying for good design right now. I mean, they're doing really good work, but they need more engagement. So I was able to, book the auditorium. We publicized it. We did what we could. It was the end of the whole Climate Action Week. And on a Saturday, 9 o'clock in the morning, we had, hundreds of people showing up. So I think that's where we can actually be generous and open it up to those communities.
Meow or woof?
Okay. You mentioned UN Global Development Goals. My main critique of them is that they are actually not in any way cross-referenced. And I would say that should be actually on our agenda. That's our field. Well, like, for instance, like what is my field is the goal of life on land and life in the cities. If you read the texts of those goals, actually life in the cities doesn't absolutely refer to any life on land, to any ecosystems or anything, and life on land doesn't absolutely refer to any life in the cities. And if you go through those goals, it is common practice. It's texts that are absolutely not related to each other and present different universes.
Just a small annotation of experience. Yeah, okay. I've been working as a social entrepreneur with SDGs, and in the way that they're applied, like if you go for a competition that asks you which SDGs you're addressing, it is actually always asked in plural. So I think one of the aims of SDGs is that to make this accessible by a more general public. So maybe when we cross-reference them inside those texts, it can really render them inaccessible. But in practice, what I saw is that it's always addressed in plural. Get 3 of them and recite us in a way how you connect this. Just little insider.
So, if I understand Maria right, it's about goals are fragments rather than presented as a system or a systemic interrelated issue. Yeah.
They are representing different universes that are actually not having relations amongst each other, if you read them. Yeah.
Hi. So I recall early on in RSD, there was quite a lot of theory and frameworks and not quite so much practice. I remember Berger's call to alter that, and I think that's been fairly well attended to. And now I see a lot of great results, but a lot of very ambiguous results, where when you have a very complicated system to which you're applying a very nuanced process with a very subtle intervention, the results are going to can be quite ambiguous. And I think that there might be a new role in the community for a second round of theory about negative results, where we want to say not only where the intervention points are, but where they aren't, and when the methods are inappropriate, or just in general start filling in some of the negative space. Because we're really good at kind of attending to the whole space right now, but being able to actually draw out some negative space of, this method for this problem really kind of doesn't apply, and build some learning in could be a direction for us.
Susu wants to reply on that.
I think that's right, and thank you for that comment. It's really important. I think we're getting to a point where we're maturing and emerging enough to be actually looking as a group at the way in which we scope and what is our parameters of operation. What do we actually know how we are working? How are we doing this as a group? We need to be more critical. What is design doing? What are you trying to achieve? How you're interacting with other disciplines? We need to start scoping much more about how we're going to be actually asking those questions more deeply. It's not always going to be okay. There are going to be more problems. We are in, what did we say? We're in this, the era of grand challenges. We just have one after the other. So perhaps we need a grand challenge about how to rescope and understand and interact with our disciplines that we're merging now. So it's a really interesting time. Yeah.
So I have a really simple grand challenge for us, which is to just learn some more math and invent some new math, right? So I think we've forgotten that systems has a whole lot of math behind it that appeals. It's very complex, and but it can create some really sort of very stuck ways of thinking. But I think that if we started to learn math from a different perspective, we can maybe invent some new math that can lead us in new directions and give us new models for things.
You need to. And that's just to add to that, the data era, 2016, it's out now. Big data's here. And so we should be engaging and embracing that in different ways. And there are new models that we can develop. Absolutely.
So if the secret host of the next RSD takes some notes on the calls, for the calls.
Hello, Chris. Am I audible? Yeah. So one of the interesting things that, they both have mentioned, it is on the similar line that in many design field and even especially in system design, there are many failures and then there's little bit success that we achieve at the end. Most of the time, and every failure is some way or the other learning to reach to the final goal. So why not we have a special session about these system failures? So that could be a very interesting scenarios because I just feel your learnings are definitely grounded in the failures. And how you coped up with it, that makes a really important decisions at the later end. And secondly, yes, with the inputs of math, cognitive sciences, cognitive psychology, sociology, anthropology, design is going to a different challenge, especially design curriculum. And when we are thinking about system design, so in coming future, we have to just re-articulate our curriculum in much more way. And it's very interesting that we have to relearn about a lot of maths, computer coding, and many other things. So what do you think about this coming future that we are going to face in academia?
I think it's the cat is winning sort of here, but I think, but I think it's a question of balance, and I think it's really cool to things are coming up, like putting attention on the non-intended consequences, non-intended ripple effects of our interventions. We have always been very aware of that's what we need to become much better, and I think some of us need to learn more math. I'm not amongst them. I would need it, but I'm not able to. So I think we have to, when we do this kind of changing the course of the ship, which we are talking about, it's always an issue not to turn too much, but to have the whole balance in mind. And I think the interesting thing is that we have those differences represented and the dialogue between them.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about failure. I mean, I'm part of kind of a system safety research where we can learn a lot about how a system fails, and in terms of human, in terms of whole system. So there are things we can explore further in that part. But also, I think Birger and Peter kind of show us journey. But I guess it's also better to stop and thinking what we learned so far. I mean, in terms of more, not just application, but also in terms of research, and then finding the gap where we have to go. I guess you cover a little bit, but I guess it's not. I need more of those kind of looking back and then what we learn and think about now and then moving forward. So that's one thing.
I have to apologize. I said something very wrong, just about turning the ship, which indicates there's one unified course. So diversifying the swarm, I would rather say.
Anyone else? Take a couple more.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to comment. Peter said something about developmental evaluation. And as far as, tracks and possible connections, there's also an overlap with the evaluation field. And we do have a systems and evaluation interest group in the American Evaluation Association. And I think, there's a lot of overlap in the questions. Like when you're talking about failure, And what you're saying to me is failure is about learning. And we've had discussions at the AEA on the tension between evaluation as learning and evaluation as accountability. And, we think there's room for both. But, and developmental evaluation slops over into strategic planning, and that slops over into design. And so, there is a lot of potential for building on, the learning here and evaluation too, and I think vice versa. So I'd like to see more interchange between those communities, because just in terms of personnel right now, there are connections, but maybe not as direct as they could be.
Thank you. Any other grand challenges? Ture.
Sure, I'll hand it off afterwards. Thank you for bringing learning into the perspective here. I think we had this taxi ride this morning with Joseph, and he told about that he wanted structural change in the city of Chicago because there are so many differences between, how the situation is in how long you live, for example. And I think that the learning aspect in systems is really important because you don't get change without motivation. And I think that learning is about motivation. I think that learning is a very important part of systems as well. So, yes, they do. So thank you for bringing in the play aspect, Birgit. I think that the motivation between change and systems behavior is an interesting aspect to follow.
Thank you. Take one more. And any?
Thank you. So just a few thoughts, trying to build on one or two things, like John, what you were saying, which we were sort of idly talking about a similar thing earlier on. My observation, just being new to this time, this is number 8, right? There seems to be like a collective desire to crystallize something that defines what we're about. But the paradox about that is much like sort of the journey that startups go on when they become scale-ups, and the sort of maturity paradox of you lose something of the freshness. So just bringing in the thoughts around diversity of thinking. So we hear that, there's lots of maths, there's lots of data, but there's also lots of more free-thinking visualization. So maybe one of the underlying principles is about that inclusivity that was mentioned earlier. I like the phrase you used about swarming or something. But just to share one more thought and possibly put a little request out. So when John and I were talking earlier, anybody that's in this room that's learned how to draw in a formal sense, that you've been at art school and learned it, you've probably done this exercise, which is where a still life is set up or an object is set up, and then the art teacher says, don't draw that, draw the spaces in between. So just picking up on the point that John made, I think there's something really important about always being able to look at that negative. So here's a thought. I've come away from this with probably 5 key words that I've heard, repeated, or maybe 1 or 2 of those are things like being humble, or anyway, I won't say them. But it'd be kind of nice to hear what everybody has as the top 5 key words that they've brought away from this. Do a word cloud and then consider what the negatives are, the opposites, the equals, the opposites. Where are the gaps in the words that we've heard? Just as a thought.
Thank you. That's a very good proposal. And I remember my drawing classes of the space in between. Yeah, you were right. That's it. Thank you.